Impulse is a group of volunteers promoting sexual health in the LGBT community. I recently lost a friend who struggled with addiction. I did not know that it was such a big problem, so we just wanted to get more involved. I don't feel that the image that we had before of somebody toothless in the street, no clothes, it is not the true image. I've seen people being successful. My friend was successful. He had a great career. He was a beautiful man. And we saw some of the signs, but he did not fit the stereotype. And that made us ignorant to react. I want to bring light in a conversation around crystal meth addiction. I also want to take away the stigma and the ignorance that we have when we think of meth addiction.
I started using when I was young. I was masking my feelings around my family and their lack of acceptance of my transitioning.
I don't know how to connect with guys, unless it's on an app or a dance floor. When I hooked up, everyone was offering me drugs. It made the sex so amazing and so much easier.
Every time I would go to the clubs, drinking just didn't do the trick. I wanted to stay up later. I wanted to party harder. The drugs were everywhere, and all my friends were doing them.
I recently had a baby, and being a single mom, working 2 jobs, not being able to get rid of the baby weight was really getting to me. A coworker of mine gave me my first bump of meth, and things suddenly seemed manageable, but only temporarily.
My issue with meth started a long time ago. I got hooked a decade ago, and my college girlfriend introduced me to it. It was readily available, and it helped me study all night long. I was feeling this overwhelming pressure from my family to achieve, and at the time, meth was the solution for me.
I got sober in my 20s when all of my friends were dying. Sobriety helped me deal with being positive and moving forward with my life. But after a back injury, I started abusing my pain meds, which led me back to alcohol. And then I found meth, which brought me to my knees.
We start using for a reason, and then it turns on us. Let's explore why. Why does this drug make us feel so good? How does it affect our brain and behavior? Why do we get so hooked on it? When we experience something we like, a message travels to the reward center of the brain, and we feel pleasure. Inside our brains, cells called neurons are constantly communicating, shaping how we think, feel, and behave. Let's take a look at how these work. Pictured here are 2 neurons. The one on the right sends the message. The one on the left receives it. The tiny space in between them is called a synapse. This is where messages are relayed. Let's take a look at how we normally receive pleasure. The sending neuron contains dopamine. This is the brain's pleasure chemical. When something good happens, this feel-good chemical is released into the synapse where it connects with the receptors. There, dopamine activates the receiving neuron, which in turn conveys the message onto the next neuron, creating a chain reaction that produces pleasure. After the message is sent, dopamine is recycled by transporters to be reused. This process happening over and over gives us the feeling of pleasure. So, simply put, when dopamine connects with the receptors in our brain, we feel good. Let's go around the group and tell me what used to bring you pleasure before you started using meth.
I used to love being at a family gathering.
Just going out to movies and dinners with my friends. You know, a nice date with a great guy.
Mm-hmm. I used to like going to bars and clubs. That was the life of the party.
When my husband and I first found out I was pregnant, that was joyous and amazing.
Excelling in school. I was really proud of that. So was my family.
Being part of my community and making a difference in people's lives.
I'm sorry, but none of this stuff comes close to that intense feeling of pleasure that meth gave us.
You're right, Pablo. You see, dopamine makes us feel good. But when we're using meth, it unnaturally raises our dopamine levels. It's synthetic, it's toxic, and nothing in our lives will ever come close to the amount of dopamine that meth releases. Take a look at this graph.
Confidence. I felt like a sexual animal.
I was in control. Everyone loved me.
Awake. I was on top of everything. I felt like the best wife and mother.
I lost all of my sexual inhibitions.
I was getting so much done. I was gonna be so successful.
As an older gay man, meth made it easier to meet younger guys. And suddenly I wasn't so invisible.
But as we all know, this feeling comes at a price. Meth unfortunately stimulates our brain to release all of its dopamine at once. Meth enters the bloodstream and travels to the reward center in the brain. That's where it invades the sending neurons. Meth causes dopamine to unnaturally leak into the neuron, then spill into the synapse. Meth blocks the transporters, which normally recycle that dopamine back into the sending neuron. This keeps the levels abnormally high, overstimulating our brains. Thus, we feel a powerful wave of pleasure, sometimes lasting as long as 8 to 12 hours from one dose. Meth causes dopamine to flood our receptors. Eventually, we exhaust the body's dopamine supply. Our body exhausts and we feel like we're running on empty, and then we crash.
Once I crashed, I just wanted to sit in a corner and die.
Sometimes I would sleep for days. Actually, it was more like a blackout.
I would call anyone, just begging for more.
I couldn't get out of bed unless I had more meth the next day.
Suddenly nothing else mattered except more. It's like, what homework? What tests? I just didn't care.
The loneliness was literally unbearable.
I hear this over and over, that suddenly meth takes over, no matter what your situation in life. It hijacks your brain, keeps you up and going for days, and then suddenly you crash like a car hitting a wall. Medically speaking, this is because all the dopamine gets used up, and it takes our bodies nearly 10 days to replenish it. No one starts out wanting to be addicted. Unfortunately, over time, you're literally changing your brain's chemistry. It's an unfortunate and unintended consequence of long-term meth usage.
You're right. One small line of meth used to make me sore. And suddenly I needed 2. And 3. It just got worse and worse.
I can really relate to that. For me, I thought I was addicted to sex, but now I realize I'm addicted to both. I couldn't have normal sex anymore. It all had to be heavier, darker, somewhat demoralizing, always with more and more meth.
I couldn't stop cheating on my girlfriend. I needed more and more sex and more meth too.
Exactly what you're all describing are various symptoms of intolerance to meth. Basically, the same dose of meth is no longer producing the same high. We up the dose, our brains ask for more. It's a never-ending cycle, and it's usually happening quicker than we even think.
I was using so much and lying about it. My doctors couldn't figure out why I was suddenly intolerant to my HIV meds.
I went from snorting it to smoking it to shooting it.
When the regular dose is no longer giving us the same rush, we take more. But now, when meth reaches the brain, it finds a lot less dopamine. Plus, our past usage has destroyed transporters. And on the receiving neuron, all that overstimulation we loved has caused receptors to withdraw. So it's just harder and harder to get high. No matter how much more you use, you can never recapture that first rush.
I would do 4 times the amount that I had started with, but it would only last for a couple minutes. Oh God, I felt so desperate.
Tolerance creates big problems in our lives. Increasing our dose or usage means we need more money to buy more drugs. Things we love simply go away. And the need for more drugs becomes the new norm.
I looked through my keyhole for hours and hours. Convinced there were people walking by waiting for me.
I used to peer through the windows of my apartment because I was convinced that there was somebody out there waiting and watching me. And my neighbors would just laugh at me and tell me to get some sleep.
When you're doing lots of meth over a long period of time, then go without sleep, you eventually experience what's known as meth psychosis. It's feelings of paranoia and fear. It's because meth stimulates the emotional center of the brain. We see things that aren't real as it affects the visual part of the brain. We hear things that aren't real as it affects the auditory part of the brain.
I heard voices coming from my shower head. It got so bad that I couldn't shower. Ever.
In our lower brains or limbic systems, we have devices that help us experience appropriate fear. Fear that helps us to survive, like moving out of the way of an oncoming car. All beings in nature have this. It's what makes animals flee from enemies. It's a life-saving device. Meth usage especially stimulates this lower part of the brain, so what used to be a natural fear response becomes a heightened and unnatural fear response, sometimes to stimulus that isn't even present. One very important thing to realize in recovery from meth usage is that the feelings of paranoia don't immediately end when we stop doing the drug. These symptoms will eventually fade as the brain heals itself. This is a reminder that addiction is a brain disorder and not a moral failure.
Last week in family group, when you were explaining this concept, it really helped my parents and me understand what was going on with me.
Knowing that the paranoia and just the awkwardness was temporary, it really helped me through those first few weeks in recovery where I felt so raw.
It's really crazy where this all takes us, before and after getting sober.
I'd like to talk to you about how this dopamine plays into the disease model of addiction. What do I mean by disease? A disease has a cause and an effect. It has a target organ, in this case it's the brain. Its symptoms are reproducible from one patient to the next, meaning what we see in patient A can be reproduced in patients B, C, and D. The symptoms of addiction are continued use despite adverse consequences, craving, obsession, loss of control, and I would add denial to this list. Denial is inherent in the very definition of addiction to me. As an addict, I'm unable to see myself clearly and truly and honestly. I can see other people's issues, I can't see my own. So when we have a recovery community that's so strong at a place like La Fuente, we sit in the middle of this recovery community and we hear other people's issues and what's going on with them. Mind you, their symptoms, which are reproducible in me, and there's something in their share that'll even passively lift the veil of denial for me, and I will be able to change something in my life, which may divert me from relapse.
I got so mad over something so simple. It's like I had no control over my emotions at all.
What did you do with my phone? Why are you hiding my phone from me, huh?
Maybe it's in your car.
Oh, maybe it's in my car,
Yeah.
huh? Yeah? Really? Is that where you left it?
For
Is that
real?
where you put it?
Come on,
Huh?
Mike.
Huh?
Meth use overstimulates the emotional centers in the brain. Heightened feelings of fear and anger are produced, which leads us to react with anger, irritability, and aggression.
Looking back, it's like I reacted to everything like a child. I would throw temper tantrums whenever anything didn't go my way.
Is your ex-boyfriend?
No.
No?
I don't talk to him.
Oh, yeah? Hey.
Come on.
What did you do with my phone, Lisa? What did you do with my... What did you do?
I haven't done anything.
What did you do with my phone?
By the time I asked myself, how did I get here? How is this happening? The cops were at my door.
Most of you enter treatment not realizing how aggressive you might have been while you were using. As you get sober, you start remembering. This fact does not excuse all the hurt we caused others, but it can help us realize and understand what was driving the behaviors and give us the tools to repair the damage.
Okay, so I understand why I can get so mad now when I never used to be an angry person. But what do I do with these feelings and cravings that just come out of the blue? What's that all about?
I would get so angry. It was almost like something else took over.
I don't know where the thought comes from, but with no warning and with no apparent reason, I feel like using.
As we've talked about, meth creates a lot of dopamine, which creates that intense pleasure we've been talking about. Our brain actively connects the people, places, and things that create the pleasure during our drug high.
I can't go to clubs or bars that I used to go to. If I see the people or I hear the music, it makes me want to get high.
I used to think I was unique because I'm gay. But hearing you say you can't go out to nightclubs and bars makes me realize I'm not that different.
Let's take a look at triggers. Identifying and understanding them is a key component to recovery. Triggers fall into two categories: external triggers and internal triggers. External triggers are the people, places, and things we associate with using. Internal triggers are the intense emotions that arise from inside us. When we come into contact with any of these triggers, our brains release dopamine, which causes us to crave. One of the most important parts of early recovery is to respect and honor the triggers with an action plan.
I had to make new friends. I had to repair my relationship with my girlfriend. I had to get new hobbies, pretty much change everything.
I removed all the sex hookup apps from my phone. I also stopped going to large dance clubs unless I had a very specific reason for being there, like a close friend's party.
I stopped driving through the neighborhoods where I used to score.
I had to admit that I was both an alcoholic and an addict. I also worked closely with my doctor to make sure that I didn't self-prescribe my medications.
Relationships of all types are so hard for me. My family already causes me so much stress, and now every interaction with them is amplified because of my using. In recovery, I had to find a way to be at peace with myself and everyone around me, or I knew I'd use again.
The most important thing to know about emotional triggers is which emotions are the most potent for you. If anger's your trigger, then know it and work on it.
I had to realize it's okay to ask for help taking care of my child.
In treatment, we teach you to identify and avoid the external triggers to the best of your ability.
I had to get honest about my traps and triggers. Number one for me is anonymous sex.
With emotional triggers, you must learn to identify them so that you can take a different kind of action towards them. Here's a summation to remember about triggers. First, we get triggered, which turns into a simple thought about using, which then creates a craving, which will drive us to use. In recovery, we have to stop this trigger thought craving process immediately after the thought. In recovery, we learn the tools to successfully accomplish this.
I just got triggered. I know I don't want to do this anymore. What can I do differently?
People like sponsors or spiritual advisors are wonderful tools to help us chart a different path in life. But we must take the actions necessary to help ourselves.
Honey, I gotta go. I gotta stick to my meeting schedule.
Okay.
All right?
Coming into a group dynamic lowers the shame, pure and simple. That's why 12-step programs work. They lower shame. You come into a group, you're able to share your own stories, you're able to hear it from somebody else and say, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. I'm not the worst of the bunch. You know, the 27-year-old that's coming out that is still experiencing an explosion in his sexuality and also exploding in his coming out of who he is and wanting to grab that and seize it, has a very different perspective on life than the guy who's 55, been there, done that. It's like looking at their motivation and why they're doing it. Treating the entire person, we can't just look at one particular behavior. Because you know what? People are more than just their addiction. They've got to remember that, we got to remember that. Yeah, sex can be affirming instead of just bad behavior.
Most women use methamphetamine as a way to self-medicate or as a way to lose weight or control their weight. And in my experience, especially working at Needle Exchange, most of the women I spoke to had, kind of complex compound trauma in their history, and methamphetamine is, at least in the beginning, a really effective way of kind of dealing and existing day to day. Women do need specific interventions because our experience with drug use is different. I think we use drugs for different reasons than men. Methamphetamine drug addiction is very powerful, but we have to figure solutions out.
I want to understand cravings better. I used to just think, I'm an addict. I crave it, and I just go get it. But what's driving that thought process?
Good question. Let me address that in a real-world scenario. Let's say you're in a store and you see something you want, but it's really expensive. Your upper rational brain will say, you can't really afford that, and you don't really need it anyway. Your lower brain, on the other hand, will simply say, you look great in that jacket, get it. When we're healthy and our body is healthy, both parts of our brain work together to make the most rational decision. Unfortunately, meth makes the lower part of our brain really strong. A trigger produces an intense go response to use. And because our usage has weakened the upper part of our brain, rational thoughts really aren't present. It's like having a desire to use that's speeding out of control and you've lost your brakes.
Now that I understand these cravings and what causes them, I think I can see what's happening and take control of it better.
I take a deep breath and work through it.
I pick up the phone and call somebody I trust to give me good advice.
I meditate, go to the gym, and I'm working on better communication with my ex-husband.
For right now, I stay away from clubs and bars.
I take 12-step meetings much more seriously than I did my first time around. And I have a new respect for the severity of the disease of addiction.
What works for me is developing a plan with my sponsor to set up boundaries around internet usage.
Managing your cravings makes them lessen with time. It helps to manage them one craving at a time and one day at a time. Let's talk about what's ahead for you on the roadmap to recovery. Stage 1 is the withdrawal stage.
They told me when I started that it would take about 60 days for the cloud to lift.
The cravings didn't leave me at all for 7 to 12 days straight. I was really scared.
I didn't want to do anything. Nothing sounded fun. All I wanted to do was sleep.
I was off meth. Suddenly I was getting violently sick from my HIV medications. I was in such despair.
I'm glad you're all sharing this. As you now know, it changes. It's temporary. In this first stage, we feel tired and depressed. We've depleted, if not exhausted, our brain's dopamine, making it difficult to function and feel normal. There's another stage following this that people refer to as hitting the wall. It's a complete lack of enthusiasm and lack of pleasure with anything. It's so important to acknowledge this stage and to know it's temporary. Feeling good again without meth or any other drug takes some time.
I did everything they told me to do, and it still wasn't changing. I started doubting the recovery process.
I got a new apartment. I got reemployed. But I was still so depressed.
Even though my grades had improved and I was back on a normal schedule, I just felt so directionless at times.
I started doubting whether I was really an addict, just like I had doubted my alcoholism 10 years earlier.
Activities that used to bring us such joy now disappoint us. Patience will prevail during this stage. The way you feel will get better. The part of the brain that we've damaged takes a lot longer to heal than we think it will.
I started wondering if this recovery thing was really for me.
These new hobbies were not bringing me the same excitement as getting high was. I definitely felt like I was missing out on something.
In early recovery, many of us will have trouble feeling pleasure or satisfaction. It's imperative that we get to the other side of this. And when we do, it shows that our brain is healing.
I had to learn to be more patient and trust that things would get better.
You know, it was a good 4 or 5 months before I even started to feel happy. It took longer for me than everyone else. Everyone else around me seemed to get it quicker. My friends were all happier a lot faster.
The effort it took to build new relationships was overwhelming. I had to remember that old adage of one day at a time.
I'd look at my baby and think, what am I doing?
I started to question if I was ever going to feel normal again. And one night I gave up. I used again.
Unfortunately, relapse is common during this stage, as feelings can overwhelm us. That's why most recovery programs will stress using the tools that we learn here to get to the other side.
Acceptance.
Surrender.
Understanding.
Self-love.
Growth.
Spirituality.
When we started using, we didn't understand the consequences. We just wanted to be understood, to find a connection, to have fun, to be in control, to be at your best, to feel good. Before we knew it, the damage was done. The good news is, when we stop using, the brain will heal. Life begins again. At the cellular level, damaged receptors and transporters regrow over a 6 to 12 month period. These scans actually show the healing process. The red area shows our brains regenerating over time. Our transporters are working again. Dopamine levels are rising and life's beginning again.
I'm not just existing in life, I'm living. I have taken actions that help me communicate better with my family, and we see each other often.
I wasn't ready before. but I know I want this. I've finally surrendered, and I'm learning new boundaries and how to love myself before loving anyone else. I know no friendships without the constant obsession of sex.
I've discovered new interests, made new friends. I now enjoy simple things, like taking a nap. And I've learned there's more to life than the bars.
I've found a nice balance between work, life, and motherhood.
After getting clean, I graduated college, and I am now sober 2 years.
Yay.
My girlfriend and I just got married, and I've actually been at the same job the entire time I was in recovery.
I learned to put my recovery first in my life, no matter what. I've become very active in my local sober community, and today there's nothing I enjoy more than helping the younger generation stay sober.
Methamphetamine addiction continues to be a big problem in our community. I think the most important thing that I want people to take away from this video is hope. I think that when you're addicted, you don't have any hope if you're the addict, if you're a family member, or just someone who loves someone who's struggling with addiction. And so it was important to provide the scientific information so that we can better understand what someone who has addiction is really going through physically. And with that, we can have more compassion and allow these people to come from out of the dark and into the light and say, hey, I need help, whether that's the addict, someone who loves the addict, or a family who is also the person who loves the addict but just doesn't understand. I hope we've accomplished that.